Have you ever wondered how long it takes to make a quilt from scratch? I'm just crazy enough to have timed the entire process from start to finish, and today I'm going to break it down for you. Hello and welcome back to another quilting video. I'm Olivia and today I'm sharing this quilt I made recently. I used the Symphony quilt pattern and this is a decently sized baby quilt. I have a spreadsheet where I track all my quilting time. When I'm in the moment quilting, I record the start and end times of the different tasks I do, and then later I go back and tally up the time spent. Today, I thought rather than walk you from start to finish through the whole process, I'd go task by task from what took the longest time to what took the least amount of time. First up is piecing and pressing. Piecing is where you sew together all the little bits of fabric into bigger bits of fabric. This quilt started from teeny tiny cuts, as you can see here, so it's not surprising that this needed a lot of time to build those tiny cuts up to full-sized quilt blocks. And then pressing is simply ironing those sewn seams. All up, I spent 9.8 hours piecing and pressing blocks for this quilt. This was 43% of my total time spent on the quilt. I don't really like having both tasks combined like this, but like I mentioned in my chain piecing experiment video with this quilt, each seam sewn needs to be pressed before I can sew another seam. And when the seams are, 1 inch or 2 inches long, that takes less than 10 seconds. And I did not want to start tracking seconds, So these steps are combined together. As well as the pressing during piecing, I also added the pressing later on after the quilt top was all assembled and those few little bits like that. So all up, 43% of the time to make this quilt was piecing and pressing. In actual time, that was 9.8 hours. And this was far and away the biggest chunk of time. The second longest task was cutting fabric down to the right size pieces, and that only took 3.8 hours. 6 whole hours less than the first task. Cutting is my least favorite part of quilting, so that was still more than long enough for me. Cutting took 17% of my time on this quilt. Next up, we've actually got a tie, and I think it's kind of interesting. Both quilting all my layers together and hand sewing the binding onto the back of the quilt took 2.3 hours each. So quilting first, this time included both the time spent marking out my quilting plan onto the basted quilt and the time spent at my machine quilting. Marking the quilting lines took less than 20 minutes, and I don't always need to do this step, so I thought it made sense to include it in here. With the binding, this is only the time spent hand finishing it. I kept making the binding and attaching it to the front of the quilt separate since, again, I don't always hand sew my binding. Machine binding and hand bindings feel very different to me and they take up very different lengths of time, so I wanted to distinguish that. So both quilting and hand finishing the binding each took up a flat 10% of my time with this quilt. Next down the list is choosing fabric. When I decided to make this quilt, I had a rough idea of the colours and feel I wanted, so I only spent 20 minutes going through my stash to pull out those few fabrics. Then I spent around 60 minutes at Spotlight filling out that bunch of fabrics with a handful more colours and an off-white background fabric. This is often my favourite part of quilting, and it took up just 6% of my time, unfortunately. Next up is assembly. This is taking all my finished quilt blocks, which were squares that were still pretty small, and sewing them together to make the full quilt top. This is a fairly mindless sort of task, and it took just 68 minutes, or 5% of the total quilting time. Now we've got another tie. Figuring out the layout for the quilt blocks, and all those little finishing tasks that I'll explain in a second, both took up 3% of my time. We'll start with the layout since that comes first. This didn't take too long because any block could go in any position. So it was just a matter of making sure each fabric was somewhat evenly dispersed across the quilt and no fabric was right next to itself, because that's a big pet peeve of mine. So it took 35 minutes playing around to find a layout I liked. I did leave it all laid out for a while. I think it was just over dinner, and then I came back, gave it a once over, and that was that. So what I call finishing is just a combination of a few things, mainly trimming threads. When you start or finish a row of machine sewing or quilting, there'll be little loose threads dangling off a little bit, and they need to be trimmed away. It also includes cutting away all the excess batting and backing fabric after the quilting and before binding. So trimming all the loose threads, cutting away excess, making sure the quilt is square and not wonky, took 36 minutes, which is 3% of the total, same as the layout. Now the next 2 tasks all took just 1% of the time each. That's basting, making the binding, and attaching the binding to the front of the quilt. Basting, I just spray basted this one. It's quick and easy and there's not much to say about it. But I will mention the backing fabric here since it doesn't have its own category this time. The backing is just a cheap bedsheet that I got on sale at Target a while back, so there wasn't much thought put into it. I didn't need to piece it, it was just ready to go. Next up is making the binding. I used 2 different fabrics from my initial fabric pull. I'll have another video up shortly about how to make quilt binding, so just quickly now, this includes cutting the strips, combining them, pressing the seams, and then pressing it all into shape. Then attaching the binding to the front was all done by machine. It took 17 minutes all up. This is a fairly small quilt, so that's just the time it took to sew around the perimeter of the quilt, fold the corners properly, and finish off the join of the 2 ends in the binding. And the final task is the design of this quilt. Just like my last quilt timing video, this one was a big fat 0. I was testing this pattern for the pattern writer, so I didn't come up with the design, I didn't change anything, there's nothing really to say about this one. I had a pattern and I followed it. Okay, so add all that up and I spent 23 hours on this quilt from start to finish. I don't think that's too bad, especially since there's a few ways I could have cut that time down quite a bit. I mentioned I used this quilt as a piecing experiment earlier, so I made half the blocks in one method and half the blocks in another method. I'll add a link to that video down below if you want to give it a look, but one method was faster than the other, so I could have saved some time by doing all the blocks in that faster way rather than half-half. And then I chose to hand finish the binding. Had I machine sewn that part, I'd probably saved around 2 hours of time. Taking a quick look back at the last time I timed the whole quilt making process, and this isn't very different with the percentages. Cutting, piecing and pressing are all pretty similar. My quilting was a bit faster this time, 10% as opposed to 15% of the totals. I think that's just a reflection of the density of the quilting. Last time my rows of stitches were a lot closer together than this time, so obviously that takes longer. And then the binding as well. Last time I added it all by machine and that took 4% of the total. This time I did it by hand and it took 10% of the total. I think as I keep doing more of these timing experiments, I'll alternate a bit between the two methods just for comparison's sake. So there we go, one more quilt making time breakdown for you. Obviously this is specific to my quilts and my style, but we see some similarities, maybe some potential patterns emerging. So hopefully it gives you a bit of a look into everything that goes into making a new quilt from scratch. The next quilt I'm going to finish and share like this is one where I wrote the pattern, so we'll finally get to see some design time in there, so keep an eye out for that. If you like these videos, please consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.